I also serve on the steering committee of American Studies, which houses the El-Kati lecture. And so what I want to do, in a minute, I'm going to ask McAllister President Suzanne Rivera to come up and give a formal welcome. Before she does that, I want to just acknowledge the presence of members of the Kente Summit here, sitting over here to my left. I want to note that in addition to the audience we have here live, we also have a Zoom audience. We also have a photographer. And so if you don't want to be photographed, then I guess you should do your best to stay out of the photographer's line of focus. If you need to use the restroom, there are restrooms around the corner. And see if there's anything else that I'm forgetting. So at this time, I invite McAllister President Suzanne Rivera to the stage.
Thank you so much, Professor Hart. Can you hear me at this distance to the mic? Great, thank you. I'm a lot shorter than he is. Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you. Welcome and bienvenidos. My name is Suzanne Rivera. I'm the president of McAllister College, and it's my great honor to launch our 8th Mahmoud El-Kati Distinguished Lectureship in American Studies tonight. With a little, yes. I'm gonna provide just a little bit more history. In 2003, Professor El-Kati retired and the American Studies Department was born at McAllister. So marking this transition, the American Studies Department established a lectureship to honor Professor El-Kati's career as a lecturer, writer, and commentator on the African American experience. From 1970 to 2003, Professor El-Kati taught many generations of McAllister students in courses such as the Black Experience since World War II and sports in the African American community. He also was a champion for increasing the diversity of the student body and for making anti-racism central to the college's curriculum. Moreover, Elder El-Kati's highest scholarly aspiration was to leverage and share the knowledge and wisdom between the MAC campus community and the local Black community to serve their mutually beneficial interests. His goal was to connect the gown with the town, and he achieved it. Elder El-Kati's classes centered the experiences of people of African descent, and did so in a way that became a teaching tool in and of itself. In his words, quote, "The American ideology of white supremacy, that's what we've always been fighting. We insisted that the history of African people from the continent to slavery to now be reflected in the curriculum. That's what the Black Studies movement was about," unquote. Elder El-Kati not only instilled a sense of duty in his students, he led by example. The fervor that Professor El-Kati brought to his teaching and activism lives on in this endowed lectureship. With generous support from Dr. Stanley Berry, Bertram Days, and Ava Days, this lectureship allows us to celebrate and honor that Elder El-Kati has been the vanguard and that he has opened the doors for others to enter. In that spirit, and with tremendous excitement, I have a very special announcement tonight. McAllister wants to permanently pay tribute to Professor Mahmoud El-Kati's legacy. And so it is my great pleasure to share with all of you for the first time in this room and for those on Zoom that the college has commissioned an artist to paint a portrait of our esteemed faculty member, which will be displayed on campus as a lasting and tangible tribute to his enormous legacy. That artist will be joining us tonight. Her name is Leslie Barlow. She was born and raised in South Minneapolis and attended Southwest High School and the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. Her work has been included in the permanent collections of the Weissman Art Museum, the Minnesota Museum of American Art, the Minnesota Vikings Fine Art Collection, and the Minnesota Historical Society. Alongside 30 or more BIPOC artists, she painted murals on boarded up businesses throughout the Twin Cities in the weeks of crisis and grief following the murder of George Floyd. I personally am a huge fan of her work, and we all are delighted and honored that her portrait of Elder El Khati will be featured on our campus. She has just arrived. Leslie, would you please remain standing so we all can appreciate you for doing this portrait? Thank you. Professor El Khati, this portrait is only one fraction of the recognition you deserve for your service to MAC and for making people of African descent central to our understanding of the world. Thank you. And now I thank you. Yes, one more round of applause. And now I'd like to ask my colleague, Professor Bill Hart, to introduce two of Professor El Khati's former students. Thank you very much.
Again, it's my pleasure to introduce two distinguished Macalester alums, Mr. Melvin Collins, who is also Mr. Collins is also a trustee emeritus at Macalester. He will speak first. Following his remarks, we'll also hear from Dr. Stanley Berry. I should note that their vintage is pretty close to mine. They are both members of the class of 1975. We'll hear from Mr. Collins and then Dr. Berry.
Good evening. Good evening. That's right, it's a celebration, not a funeral. So I am very pleased to be able to make a few comments about the Elder Mahmoud. So let me start off with Mahmoud El Khati. Griot, preserver of history, conveyor of history, one whose mission has been to replace the missing pages of American history for the benefit of all people, simply because the truth will always set you free. In African culture, the griot is the wise elder who shares the history, traditions, and aspirations of the clan and community. Mahmoud has been that for the Macalester and Twin Cities community for over 50 years. It would be difficult to track the impact of his work and his presence. There are no superlatives or adjectives to capture that. My association with Mahmoud goes back to my first days in Minnesota. His class was the first in my college career. It was an 8:30 class that marked my introduction to the Macalester academic experience. The room was packed to capacity. Needless to say, I was in awe of the breadth of his knowledge and passion for his subject. I was immediately smitten, and a little bit of the culture shock I had been experiencing coming from the projects of St. Louis, Missouri, had been lessened. He was always ahead of his time and ahead of the curve with his analysis of issues related to our struggle, with impactful insight before it became the popular discourse of the day. And that has been the case over and over again. Mahmoud was woke before woke was woke. Back in the day, he was our Encyclopedia Africana. I would sometimes be in discourse with folk, and we'd be talking about critical issues, and I would have a WWMS moment. What would Mahmoud say? Mahmoud is an intellectual heavyweight who is as common as the most common man. He never gets too full of himself or think that he is above others. The ease of being able to operate effectively among the intellectual elite and the working class is what makes him unique. His academic prowess is impressive, and his commitment to community is unparalleled. It is the spirit of this commitment that is so infectious. As a student at Macalester, my passion to make a positive contribution to community was heightened and fueled by my relationship with and exposure to Mahmoud. In fact, most students of color from my era who I speak to either mention Mahmoud as their mentor or one of the most influential individuals in their college career. As many students sought clarity on their identity or to validate their self-worth, Mahmoud was an encouraging and influential force. He believes it is our collective duty to improve the human condition, and he believes that passionately. He embodies integrity and is one of the most credible scholars you will ever meet. He doesn't attempt to craft a perspective for others to blindly embrace. He challenges others to think critically and beyond the obvious to craft their own informed perspective and not be fooled by the noise of the day or go for the okie-doke. He is the forever teacher who will probably utter something very instructive with his last breath, something we can treasure. That is the man that this lectureship honors, a living legend, an icon, a true humanitarian. We love you, brother.
I need to push this over. No. So I really wish they had reversed the order and Melvin had followed me, but that's not my lot. Somebody told me or wrote me a note and said to keep this to 2 minutes, and I was really a little insulted because I didn't know how they would know me to write a note like that. But then walking in here, I was told that I could take as much time as I wanted, but I'm not going to do that. But some of you probably noticed that when Dr. Rivera stood up here, I think I was the first one to pop up, and that's kind of hard for me because I'm old now. But the reason that I did that is because she wrote me a note after the article was published in the Mac today and said, thank you for your participation in this, and I aim to bring this endowment up to the financial level that it needs to be. It was a handwritten note. And by God, last several months ago, as many of you know, there was a 12-day online fundraiser, and she brought the lectureship up to the $250,000 level that will allow us the 5% every year to have a lecture. So I want to thank her. I also, in terms of starting the lecture, I gotta thank my co-conspirator, Bertram Days and Ava Days. Many of you don't know Bert, but Bert and I were following a tradition that we weren't even aware of at the time, and that is that if you get disciplined or kicked off campus, as what happened to me. In the spirit of DeWitt Wallace, you come back and give to your college. And so I am here to tell you that it was Bert's fault. I was innocent, but things go the way they go. I also want to thank Melvin Collins, and I want to thank Rudy Grubb, and I want to thank Kathy Pinkett, who's not here right now, because they stepped in big time at the beginning of this thing to make it happen. So thank you very much. I also want to thank people watching on video, a couple in DC, Marion and Elsa Brown, who have no other connection to the college other than Elsa's little brother went here, Tim Clark, and they also have given financial support over the years for no other reason than out of the goodness of their heart and a belief in the mission of this lectureship. So having said that, and I am going to be brief, you got to understand, I was 12 years old in North Minneapolis when I first met this man who came to the community wearing funny looking shirts, dashikis, which I didn't know about, with a funny looking haircut called an afro, which I didn't know about. And he began to teach us about things that I did not know about, that Black people, African people were among the first mathematicians, the first scientists, the builders of the pyramids, and that we managed to advance in the United States of America in all areas, whether it was science or whether it was art. We gave America its only original music, jazz music, under conditions that would have made many other groups of people wilt under the continuous assault, which hasn't stopped to this day. So really, and I gave Mahmoud a note tonight, which I don't think he's read yet, but the note says, thank you for 56 years of friendship, of teaching, of mentorship. And the only way that I can pay him back is by trying to be an example and be an explainer and a teacher of what this Black experience was for me to younger generations. And so with that, I will stop. Thank you, Mahmoud. Thank you for everything you have taught me and guided me and directed me in. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Collins and Dr. Berry. If I'm smiling, it's because I'm really stoked about introducing tonight's speaker. It's my supreme pleasure this evening to introduce this year's Mahmoud El-Kati Distinguished Lecturer. The speaker is no stranger to us. She's one of us. I speak of our friend and colleague, a former professor of history at Macalester College, Dr. Crystal Moten. Crystal, as her name suggests, is a jewel, and we are fortunate to have her. Dr. Moten is currently the curator of African American history at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. She is responsible for building the museum's collections as they relate to the material culture and history of African American business and labor. During her time at Macalester, she worked on History Harvest in the historic Rondo neighborhood and collaborated with our honoree, Elder El-Kati. This included presenting at the New School of African American Thought, which is organized by Solidarity Twin Cities. Dr. Moten researches African American women's history, business history, working class history, and intellectual history, especially as they relate to the struggles of African Americans for economic justice. Dr. Moten has a book under contract with Vanderbilt University Press titled, This Woman's Work, Black Women's Economic Justice in Post-War Milwaukee. Tonight, she will speak on the topic of creating during crisis. Historically, historically relevant reflections for troubled times. By exploring her story of a group of Black working women in America's heartland, this lecture illuminates the imaginative ways these women responded to a number of intersecting social, political, and economic crises facing their community in the mid-20th century urban Midwest. I present to you Dr. Crystal Moten.
Thank you all so much. It is so good to see so many familiar faces, even though I can't quite really tell who you are because you're wearing masks. But also thank you, Bill, for that generous introduction. I am so pleased to be here with you tonight. And while I no longer work here at McAllister, I still consider myself a member of the Mac family. And so being invited to give the El Kati lecture holds tremendous meaning for me, especially having taught African American history in the same department Elder El Kati taught, literally traversing the path he cleared. This is amazing. I would like to take the opportunity to publicly thank everyone who played a part in getting me here. I do not believe in coincidences, but I do believe that getting to the point where you are in the present moment is the accumulation of several decisions taken over the course of time by you and for you, by people you know and don't know. And though none of us knew this at the moment, a short note from Dr. Duchess Harris set the events in motion that led to me being here tonight. And so I thank her. I thank President Rivera. You can clap. I thank President Rivera for formally inviting me. I also thank Miana Kerr for the part she played. And much gratitude to Jackie Starbert for all the extremely responsive administrative and logistical coordinating details she helped with. And thanks to all of you who've shown up tonight in person and online. Last but not least, the public affirmation of my gratitude ends where I would like to begin my talk tonight. With the Black women ancestors who came before us, whose histories I share tonight with the hope that we might learn from their examples of strength, courage, resilience, their determined decisions to create during crisis. Tonight, I want to offer historically relevant reflections for our troubling times. No doubt, we are living through multiple crises. Although we have measures in place to protect our community here, we are still living in the midst of a tremendous global health crisis. Our public health mandates, as well as our decision to prioritize and practice collective care, enable us to gather here safely tonight. But we are literally suffocating our planet, endangering plant and animal species because of our insatiable and ever-growing desire for wealth and consumption. Our politics continue to divide us, and our disagreements do not merely boil down to differences in political ideology. At the heart, this divisiveness is the difference between who or what thrives or struggles, who or what lives and dies. At the same time that there have been radical transformations related to how our society perceives and values different expressions of race, religion, gender, sexuality, and ability, we are living through national and global intensifications of anti-Black racism, misogynoir, homophobia, transphobia, and reproductive injustice, both through law and customs. Multiple crises. An honest and open-hearted awareness of our current health, environmental, political, and social landscape could send us into the depths of despair. But despair is not where we are going tonight. Instead, we are going to spend some time dwelling in the spirit of Sankofa, which is an Akan word that means retrieve, or literally go back and get. Journey with me as we go Black in herstory. The herstory that I'd like to share with you today is one that I have carried with me for a long time. I encountered the herstory of these women nearly 2 decades ago, and I always go back and study these women because their actions and experiences always teach me something new every time. I usually glean something that helps me comprehend the current moment while also providing substance and sustenance for the very troubled times we find ourselves experiencing. So let me set the scene. The time, the mid-20th century, the 1940s and the 1950s. The place, the urban Midwestern United States, Wisconsin, a neighbor, to be specific. The people, Black women community organizers who lived and worked in Milwaukee. The crisis, several, in economic depression, global war and conflict, political persecution, and for Black people, connected to all those aforementioned, the enduring challenge of sustaining Black aliveness and humanity in a Jim Crow nation beset on death, destruction, and inhumanity. Black women, specifically urban Black women living during this time period, felt this acutely as these unstable and dangerous circumstances manifested in their daily lives, impacting their economic, educational, social, and political possibilities. So I want to zero in on this herstory by focusing on the lessons we can learn from how a small, determined group of Black women responded when confronted with overwhelmingly troubling times. Specifically, I want to ruminate on records, ruptures, and refusals. Records, ruptures, and refusals. As a historian, records are important. We rely on historical records, primary sources, to aid us in our interpretation of the past. These records, usually held in community, institutional, and sometimes personal archives, are socially mediated and constructed, and they, at their best, provide incomplete accounts of the past we seek to explore. At their worst, they are one-sided, celebrating the privileged and the powerful. Yet we build our interpretations on these records. If we are looking for a modern term, we might consider records receipts, right? Records or receipts, then, are the evidence we gather that aid us in making and supporting our broader claims. In this story, we will see how Black women gather and deploy their receipts in service of Black liberation. Ruptures. Ruptures can be understood in 2 ways, or multiple ways, actually. But 2 ways I want to explore tonight relate to the particular herstory I'll tell you. 1, an instance of breaking or bursting subtly and completely. Or 2, as a breach of a harmonious relationship. Now, harmonious might be too strong a description as it relates to tonight's illustration, but nonetheless, we will examine the impact of a racially inflected organizational rupture on Black women's work. Refusals. Rather than single-handedly take on the responsibility of repairing this racially inflected breach, Black women refused. Refusing social and economic degradation and mistreatment their actions forced a necessary reckoning. Records, ruptures, refusals. Journey with me as we go Black in history. So Milwaukee, during the height of World War II, was a particularly vibrant place. In terms of population size, you may be astonished to know, as I was, that it was this nation's 13th largest city, coming right after San Francisco and Pittsburgh. Some refer to Milwaukee as Brew City, in recognition of its German-influenced heritage and culture, which resulted in many brewing companies throughout the city. In other words, folks have fun. Due to its various industries, manufacturing companies that produced everything from farm equipment to airplane and auto parts to batteries, clothing, and textiles, Milwaukee came to be known as one of the great working class cities in the nation's industrial heartland. And during this period, Milwaukee's Black population grew dramatically, increasing nearly 150% from about 9,000 people in 1940 to almost 22,000 people in 1950. But even with this tremendous growth, Black people only made up about 3.5% of the city's population. Still, during this moment, Black people were increasingly visible on the urban industrial landscape. Though most of the Black women migrants who fled the South looking for better work actually labored in similar positions as they had when they left the South, we know that in 1940, 64% of Black women labored in the domestic service industry, cooking, washing, scrubbing, or sweeping other people's behinds, homes, offices, and restaurants. Black working women frequently compared their work experience in Milwaukee to the South and expressed frustration that employment opportunities were foreclosed in Milwaukee for similar reasons as the South: sexism and racism. Inequality, employment inequality, was built into the structure of most workplaces, be they public or private. Racism operated through bureaucracy and intense focus on policy and procedure. Policies and procedures which were supposedly race blind, but not race neutral. These policies and procedures had disparate effects on Black working women's economic possibilities. Take, for example, the requirement of proof of a 10th grade education for an entry-level position at a local manufacturing company. Anyone will do. If a Black woman had come from a state like Mississippi, Alabama, or Georgia, where separate and unequal education prevailed, and which made going to school a legal and practical impossibility, how then would a person be able to magically procure proof of a 10th grade education that mostly did not exist? But a question even more important: why was this level of education necessary at all for skills and training that could be taught on the job? Racism manifesting through policy and procedure. As well as this, the nature of work in the Jim Crow Midwest did mean last hired, first fired, lowly paid, and dirty work. All of these were true. And there was also the type of work that was considered, quote, back of the house work. Sometimes Black working women in Milwaukee could get a job in a downtown store or restaurant or hospital. However, the positions offered to her were in the back, at the bottom, and out of sight. Positions like stock girls or dishwashers were hidden from public view and required little interaction with the white public. In Milwaukee, Black women also worked as nursing assistants, a backbreaking job considered undesirable by white working women. But as a result of World War II, by 1950, Black women had made some gains, especially in the urban industrial manufacturing workforce. The number of women in these types of jobs did increase to 30%, up from 21%. Still, 52% of Black working women laboring in Milwaukee worked in domestic or other service industries. Black women continue to be locked out of some of the most desirable and higher paying clerical roles, jobs which were usually reserved for white working women. In the back, on the bottom, stuck in the lowest, dirtiest positions, records, refusals, ruptures. Enter Black women community organizers, women who surveyed the landscape, determined what was possible, and worked hard to create a new reality. For the purposes of our short time together, I am intentionally only going to focus on 2 women tonight. Because when you leave this place, I want you to know, remember, and invoke these women's names, because these are her stories we need for times like these. Bernice Copeland Lindsay. Nana Reed Baker. Both of these Black women had long roots in the Black Midwest, and both of these women dedicated their lives to their communities, not simply in response or reaction to ongoing attempts to deny Black life and humanity, which saw Black people as deficient and insufficient, but precisely because they firmly knew and believed in the opposite. From these convictions, they strategically chose to work with and align themselves with people and organizations who they could partner with, influence, and walk with on the path toward Black uplift. 1 minute. In Milwaukee and the nation during this time, one of the most recognized and celebrated gender-based organizations that many Black women felt compelled to join, become members of, and develop their leadership capacity through was the Young Women's Christian Association, or the YWCA, which still is in existence today, and some of you may know of it and be affiliated with it. Yes. Awesome. A local affiliate of this organization was the Milwaukee Y. The Milwaukee Y had been organized in the city during the Progressive era as one way to support the increasing number of white working women leaving their rural towns and villages to come to the big city to live and labor. The Milwaukee Y, with its Christian morals and values, became known for the quality, clean, affordable housing it offered to white working women. While the Y had lofty goals during this time period, racism still permeated the organization. As more and more Black working women moved to Milwaukee, however, some of the white women leaders at the Y wanted to offer their spiritual and sisterly assistance to Black women workers. Knowing they could not do so alone, with awareness, they partnered with the Milwaukee Urban League, which itself had opened its doors in the city in 1919. As a result of this partnership, the organization created 3 programmatic opportunities for Black women and girls. One which provided a gathering place for workers, one which centered around community service and volunteering, and one that focused on activities geared toward young girls. After nearly a decade of trying to run these programs on their own, and not being particularly successful, the Milwaukee Y hired Bernice Copeland Lindsay, a trained journalist and social worker who was to manage these efforts. Of course, and as you can imagine, Lindsay was the first Black professional worker they'd ever hired. And so it's worth pausing here for a moment to spend some time discussing Bernice Lindsay's background, mostly because, of course, where she came from directly influenced her life's work, but also because everywhere she went, she created and left a record. Bernice Lindsay was born and raised in Winchester, Indiana in 1896, a small Quaker community which had its roots in the anti-slavery movement. In 1830, her grandfather, Dennis, a self-freed Black man, moved to Winchester after he purchased the freedom of himself and his wife, Janetta. He made a life for himself and his family, and he prized education, family, and community involvement. We know this because of where he chose to move his family. Indiana in the 1830s was home to several free Black settlements, and Winchester was a mere 6 miles away from one called Snow Hill and 10 miles away from one called Cabin Creek. Snow Hill and Cabin Creek, both in Randolph County, were near stops on the Underground Railroad. Both of these communities were self-sufficient, free Black settlements known for assisting and supporting newly self-free people. Lindsay grew up within this context and community. She grew up in a context where the belief that anything was possible flourished. Also, time and time again, Lindsay's parents reminded her that one's race should not be a determining factor in one's life possibilities. She followed in the footsteps of her father, Benjamin, and her older brother, William, both of whom attended the all-white Winchester High School. She ended up matriculating at Ohio State University, becoming the first Black woman to graduate from the university's School of Journalism. While at Ohio State University, I should say the Ohio State University, a chance encounter with Jane Addams, the respected social worker and founder of the Hull House in Chicago, inspired her to change her minor from mathematics to social work. She worked for the Y as her first job out of college. Before she got to Milwaukee, she actually worked at Indianapolis, at the Indianapolis YWCA, specifically at the segregated Phyllis Wheatley branch, which Black women, including the famous beauty mogul and millionaire philanthropist, Madam C.J. Walker, helped to fund and fundraise for. The several years she spent in Indianapolis concretized her ideas about community organizing. In some circles, Lindsay represented the traditional idea that college-educated Black people could and should represent and speak on behalf of the race. But she also challenged this idea with her own philosophies and beliefs regarding community involvement. She believed that everyone should engage in what she referred to as group work. Essentially, group work, and college students may be familiar with group work. Group work was her way of describing community organizing. And group work called for all community members, no matter their class or educational background, to unite to work on issues of significance and importance. She also defined and promoted a particular type of leadership she described as, quote, indigenous neighborhood leadership. These neighborhood leaders, she thought, were better able to understand and create solutions to pressing community concerns than folks who may have come outside or come from outside of the community. Although Lindsay's educational background, her professional experiences, and eventually, not starting out, eventually her socioeconomic class standing might have placed her in W.E.B. Du Bois's category of a talented 10th race leader. But her actions and her philosophy also placed her in the category of a neighborhood organizer who prized community-oriented, solutions-focused collaboration. The Milwaukee Y, after she proved herself in Indianapolis, hired her to manage its outreach to Black women and girls. By the 1940s, the heart of this herstory, she'd been at the Milwaukee Y for over a decade, but she was overworked, often the only full-time staff person, working 60 to 70 hours a week, laboring, recruiting Black women and girls into the programs of the Y, developing Indigenous neighborhood leaders, and working with folks on a path to racial uplift. She did that by herself single-handedly until 1941, when the Y decided it wanted to hire another full-time Black woman, Nana Reed Baker. Although much less exists in the historical record about Baker's personal history, what does exist lets us know that she grew up in Milwaukee. She attended public schools in the city. She was a person of faith who found community in a Black church. And she also came of age at the Milwaukee Y, attending and participating in the organization's youth programs, presumably under Bernice Lindsay's amazing leadership and mentorship. After attending college, the Milwaukee Y hired her to direct its teenage programs. Bernice Copeland Lindsay, Nana Reed Baker. These Black women were the only full-time paid Milwaukee staff members employed to fulfill the organization's lofty mission of engaging Black working women and girls in a city where the Black population, as you recall from above, was growing tremendously year after year during the 1940s. Recall also the labor conditions I explored with you earlier. And also bring into your awareness the fact that employment discrimination often combined with educational inequality and housing insecurity. But putting their heads together, deploying their ideas about group work and the role of neighborhood leaders, Lindsay and Baker created a space where Black people could gather and organize around these intersecting crises. They called this place the Walnut Street Center. Walnut Street was the main artery in the neighborhood where most Black Milwaukeeans lived. The street was the neighborhood's social, cultural, and economic epicenter, with its Black-owned grocery stores, beauty parlors, barbershops, a gas station, clothing shops, funeral homes, did I say restaurants, a movie theater, nightclubs, bars. If anyone knows anything about the historic Rondo neighborhood, Rondo Avenue, right? There are definitely some parallels there. While the Walnut Street Center had many residences, during the 1940s, its longest dwelling was a former Milwaukee public school building at least. Situated on prime real estate, the center was literally in the heart of the community. The Walnut Street Center then was a neighborhood hub. a space to convene with like-minded women and girls who shared a working class background, a place to engage in meaningful dialogue and discussion about politics and labor, a place to address and prioritize Black working women's housing, educational, and professional development needs, a place for Black women and girls to develop as community leaders. And from this center, Black women and girls engaged in a myriad of actions, focusing on many key areas. Take, for instance, their work around housing insecurity. With the help of volunteers and short-term workers, many of whom were newly migrated Black women, the Walnut Street Center kept an active rooms registry for newly migrated women who needed safe and secure housing, especially again during this increased migration period. Over 100 Black women use this registry every day. In addition to this practical solution to housing insecurity, Black white women also conducted in-person house-by-house surveys that identified inadequate and dilapidated housing in the neighborhood. Many white absentee landlords managed these notoriously horrible dwellings, carving out small rooms and renting them, often with shared facilities, to multiple families. These unsafe and unkept dwellings endangered the lives of Black families and drained their meager incomes because most times absentee landlords charge double and triple the rate for these types of dwellings. The center sent the results of their surveys to the City Department of Health, which led to many of these dwellings being shut down, right? And so you see Black white women working with individual women, working with structures in the city, and then also creating, joining, and leading citywide committees that agitated for affordable housing. Take another example, Y member and beautician Maddie DeWeese. Maddie DeWeese was a beautician who'd opened her own beauty school for Black women in the city, but she also served as the president of the Better Housing Community Club. This organization held forums about the benefits of affordable public housing projects sponsored by the state and federal government. They agitated and spoke out against private corporations who had a vested interest in keeping publicly affordable housing out of the community for racial and economic reasons. Additionally, they petitioned city leaders to not only demolish older dilapidated buildings, but also to build replacement housing. The Better Housing Community Club, under Maddie DeWeese's leadership, hosted discussions with members in the community and then broadcasted and advocated for their concerns and needs. The Walnut Street Center also prioritized its work with young Black girls and women, which Nana Reed Baker directed, reported on, and created records about. The center's teenage department was organized into smaller groups or clubs, and they were based on age and interests. These clubs provided opportunities for Black girls to develop leadership, organizational, communication, and social skills. The department consistently hosted 4 to 6 clubs and had estimated memberships hovering between 100 and 200 girls. Baker reported and recorded several highlights of the girls' work. At the beginning of, for example, at the beginning of each programming year, the young girls planned events that united Black girls across the city, inviting them to become Y members. The young women also participated in regional and national conferences held in the city and in states across the region. While Baker directed the activities of the young women and in the teenage department, she also led a committee of 10 adult Black women who helped in supervising and mentoring the girls. The committee met once a month, chaperoned events, and served as the nucleus for a parent-teacher association at one of the neighborhood schools. Baker described this group of women as very active, who worked faithfully to accomplish much for the girls in our community. Under Nana Reed Baker's leadership, the teenage department thrived. It wasn't simply about providing social or recreational activities to young people. Baker, who grew up in the community and who was influenced by her own participation at the Y, found her vision and purpose in the collective and collaborative development of young people who she believed would go on to help address and provide solutions to the community's most pressing needs. Eventually, because of their success, the Milwaukee Y hired another Black woman, Jean Hopkins, a young Black college graduate, to coordinate the activities of young adult Black women who joined the Y in increasing numbers. So then these three Black women, Lindsay, Baker, and for a short time Hopkins, plus the hundreds of Black women and girls who walked through the doors of the Walnut Street Center and became Y members, and the nearly 10,000 annual community members who attended the programs and used the center's resources, considered the Walnut Street Center a safe Black space in the city, a home away from home of sorts. But these organizers did this work under tremendous hardship, with increasingly dwindling financial resources. And this came to a breaking point by the end of the decade. In 1948, the Milwaukee Y became aware that the lease on the Walnut Street Center was expiring. And because the building was set to be demolished, they had to find the center a new home. The Y's leaders engaged the Walnut Street workers by asking for their suggestions, which they promptly ignored. The clock ran out on the lease, and the Milwaukee Y leadership made the executive decision to relocate all the activities of the Walnut Street Center to the downtown Y. Now, the downtown Y headquarters was located about 2 miles away, but this downtown headquarters had a predominantly white membership. But this wasn't by formal policy, it was by culture and custom. Rupture. This hasty relocation, also a forced integration, decreased Black Y participation by 80%. In addition to a drastic decrease in participation, Lindsay, Baker, and Hopkins recorded in detail the impact of the move. In the annual report of their activities, Lindsay noted, attendance at club, committee, and interest group meetings has reached an all-time low. Relocation meant giving up our mass recreation programs or open houses, and also the scrapping of our young adult activities program entirely. Our rooms registry, which served over 100 women a day, practically folded up because the people who came seeking rooms were usually served over the counter. And sometimes they needed to come back 3 or 4 times. And the location of the Central Y proved too inconvenient for this type of service. Baker described a slow disintegration of groups as to numbers, activity, and interest. And in spite of staff correspondence, phone calls, home visits, home meetings, and the use of a room back in the Walnut Street neighborhood, the community was drastically affected. Baker noted the importance of actual statistics and their ability sometimes, in her words, to speak more clearly than words. She offered one example of one club. Before the forced move, the club had an active membership of 30 participants. Since the move, club attendance had ranged from 0 to 9 members at recent meetings. In addition to the low attendance in the actual clubs, Baker spoke of the loss of the entire group of the 10 women I just told you about earlier, who mentored the young girls and the young women in the teenage department, the entire group. Reading Baker's report, one can get a sense of the devastating impact of this rupture on the WISE Black women workers, volunteers, members, and participants. In reporting on the impact of this rupture, Baker took nothing for granted. While the downtown Y was again under 2 miles away from the former Walnut Street Center, this distance was simply too huge for working class women and girls who had to travel usually after work and school and while balancing other personal and professional responsibilities. When Baker queried members from one of the senior youth groups about why their plans to meet downtown just didn't work out, she received several telling responses. First, the girls wanted to be close to home so they could have a meal before participating in the WISE programs. The distance factor was doubly difficult during Wisconsin's long and hard, and did I say long and hard winters? We know something about that here. Second, meeting close to home meant they would not have to pay car fare to get to the building. Walking was simply not an option for them. Third, many of the girls had responsibilities they needed to attend to before club meetings. And so taken together, participation in the Y no longer fit within their life or their schedules, nor was it feasible. Their responses highlighted the serious importance of being in close proximity to one's community, but also the physical and financial resources one needed to be able to participate in programs at the central building. While dealing with the loss of their center, Black Y staffers knew in close proximity to white workers starkly illuminated the unequal pay practices they endured as well. It was common knowledge that the Milwaukee Y paid white and Black staff members different wages, even if they held the same position. Bernice Lindsay had worked at the Milwaukee Y for over 20 years without a raise and without reaching the uppermost limit of the salary range for her position. Nannery Baker had worked at the center for 7 years without a raise. So when the Milwaukee Y sent out contract renewal letters, the women reached a breaking point. The Y neither recognized the tremendous work of these women, nor did they increase their salaries. Citing budget shortfalls, the Milwaukee Y renewed the contracts, but at the same salary levels. This felt like a slap in the face to these women. Refusal. Nannery Baker immediately sent a letter of resignation to the organization, citing its failure to increase her salary as the reason for her leaving the position. Referring to her record, Baker stated that the salary she was offered was, quote, inadequate for the developing service she believed she offered the Y during her years of employment. A service and a record consistently and clearly visible over the years of her employment. Bernice Lindsay did not immediately resign her position. Instead, she wrote a letter which provided a record, receipts, of how she had earned her raise through her consistent and steady work. Her letter is worth reading. She wrote to the personnel committee, my dear friends, I received your letter concerning salary raises last week, and I did not sign the enclosed contract because I thought there were some factors that needed additional consideration. My work with the association has been more than a job. It has been a challenge and a satisfaction to give whatever ability I have to be building better human relations. I have known for a long time that salaries in our department were below those in other departments. But feeling a certain responsibility as the first Negro secretary and wanting to prove that inclusiveness in the YWCA is an asset, I have tried to be objective and minimize this difference. I have tried to keep abreast and ahead of my job by doing graduate work at various universities and attending many conferences and conventions, usually at my own expense, and by giving unstintedly of my time, effort, and interest. If you feel, however, that my work is not good enough, then that is reason enough for your decision. Every worker, she continues, I believe, usually knows deep down in her heart whether she is worthy of her hire or not. And I know I have paid a high price for being the pioneer Negro staff member. A few years ago, the maximum salary for department heads was $3,600. And in all fairness, after 20 years of service, I should be receiving that maximum, unless, as I said before, my work is not satisfactory. One other thing I think you should know, on the center staff, we have always known each other's salary because salaries for all of us have been lower than those of white employees. And I did not want my coworkers to think this was true because I was getting a big salary. We needed to have utmost confidence in each other to carry out our difficult assignment. Although we have accepted the theory of integration, we know that the promotion of Negro staff members to certain jobs is not likely. I hope you know me well enough to believe that I am saying these things now, not because of bitterness, but because I think we need to know and recognize our problems and make the next step forward, however short it may be. Fully appreciating your concern and thanking you for all you have done for me, I am sincerely and prayerfully yours, Bernice Copeland Lindsay. After receiving Lindsay's letter, the personnel committee met. And so in minutes from that meeting, the committee's recording secretary, Florence Breen, wrote the following. Contracts were sent to Ms. Lindsay and Ms. Baker, which would automatically mean that their work had been satisfactory and that the Y would be glad to have them remain on the staff. However, no salary increase was indicated in the contracts for next year. The personnel committee tried seriously to evaluate the work done by each of these staff members. In discussing the work of each of these individuals, not on the basis of race, we expressed appreciation of service and work done by each, but felt that they had not tried quite hard enough to fit into the picture. They haven't taken the initiative in doing the kinds of things expected of executives in their jobs. What is telling about the personnel committee's assessment of Lindsay and Baker's work is that there is no recognition of the impact of the loss of the Walnut Street Center. Additionally, the Personnel Committee blamed these Black women workers for not fitting into the picture. The picture was an image crafted by an organization with predominantly white leadership who held little regard for Black women workers, the Black women workers it hired, or its previously large Black membership. So how could they fit into the image when they were marginalized and outside of the picture to begin with? These Black women's refusals created a reckoning which made its way into the media. The Chicago Defender, one of the most preeminent Black national newspapers operating out of the centers of the country's industrial Midwest, ran an explosive article with the title, "Milwaukee Negro YWCA Staff Quits When Lily White Program Starts." The newspaper article addressed the problems that caused Lindsay, Baker, and Hopkins to resign their positions, and also featured an interview with Bernice Lindsay. In the article, Lindsay described their work, which I just noted for you here, and how she and her co-workers did this work in under-resourced, underfunded conditions, and that the organization had made top-down decisions without consulting the communities who would be most affected. Relying on the work records of her and her colleagues, Lindsay brought the receipts, her verbal testimony, and the literal results of her work to bear on the crisis she and her coworkers were currently enduring. Lindsay's decision to tell her story to the Chicago Defender was one more receipt she added to the record. And by exposing these conditions, she told her story to a national newspaper, which again forced a racial reckoning, a reckoning that continued to play out over the next several decades at the Milwaukee Y. This reckoning, however, removed the burden of grappling with white racism from their shoulders and placed it back where it belonged, on the people and the structures responsible for producing and maintaining racialized inequality in the first place. Records, ruptures, refusals. Baker, Hopkins, and Lindsay's collective refusals reveal much about how they thought about themselves as organizers and workers, and also what they thought about the nature of what their own action and activism should be. Together, they recorded their contributions and their grievances. Together, they demanded fair wages. And together, they refused to continue their work at the Y when it willfully and disrespectfully ignored their complaints. Records, ruptures, and refusals. Reflecting on what these women created during these troubling times, as well as what they refused, provides lessons and questions for us. What record will you rely on to both aid you in your interpretation of the past and help guide your present work toward responsible action and justice? What inequality will you refuse? Will your actions open up possibilities for a more equitable and livable present and future? I hope you will keep Bernice Copeland Lindsay and Nannery Baker in your mind as you reflect on the answers to these pressing questions. Thank you.
So we have a little time for Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, we have a mic over to my left. And so everyone who wants to ask a question should line up at the mic. After the Q&A, we're going to have remarks from the elder.
Don't know, run up at once.
Thank you for a wonderful, wonderful lecture. My question is this: what happens to these women afterwards?
Thank you. And so the question is, what happened to Bernice Copeland Lindsay, Nana Reed Baker, Jean Hopkins after they refused to continue to work under the conditions they did at the Y? Well, Bernice Copeland Lindsay continued her work in the Milwaukee community, but went on to work for the county department of Milwaukee County Department of Welfare. Jean Hopkins also continued her work in the city, as did Nana Reed Baker, although it's a bit unclear about what they got up to immediately following their disconnection from the Y. The other question, though, or the other thought that I think is important to think about is that I mentioned that their actions caused a racial reckoning, right? That the Y had to grapple with and deal with after their basically entire Black women workforce left. That reckoning took place over decades. Eventually, by the 1960s, the Y brought more Black women onto its board of directors, which the board of directors were the leaders at the Y who determined Y policy and procedure. With the increased kind of diversity of their board, they hired the first Black woman president of their board elected the first Black woman president of their board in the late 1960s. And under this woman's work, a lot of change happened in the Y, including the Y doing an internal assessment, right, of the racist kind of workplace and culture that permeated the organization, but also thinking about how to deal with that. One of the national developments in the national Y was the One Imperative Eliminate Racism, which came out of a national conference and a national mandate for the Y to really think about the racism that permeated the organization. And Black Y women in Milwaukee were crucial to developing and to implementing that national Y mandate of eliminating racism, such that by the 1970s, the Milwaukee's board was more diverse, its staff was more diverse, not only including Black women, but also Indigenous women, Latina women, and also Asian American women. And so really, these Black Y women in the 1940s, remember, right, caused this racial reckoning. And it's really important to think about timing here. These stories might sound familiar because we're thinking, oh, this could be a contemporary story, but no, this is the 1940s, right? In the urban Midwest, prior to, landmark court decisions like Brown versus Board of Education, prior to hallmark civil rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, right? These women are working in their communities, trying to change the circumstances, not only for Black women, right? Their work impacts more and multiple people, and they're doing this all before what we consider as kind of the mainstream, and we can question that term, civil rights movement. So it's really important to think about that. And that was more than what you asked, but I felt it was necessary.
Thank you, Miana. Can you share with everyone, particularly the students who are always looking for internships, some of the things that you do at the Smithsonian?
Oh, awesome. Yes, I can. So as a curator, what I primarily do is I think about how to understand Black history, but through objects, right? And so if you think about a record, I like the word record now. If you think about how you would tell the story of Black people's history in this country particularly, what kinds of objects do you think you would need to tell that story? And so what I do at the Smithsonian is I focus on Black women and business and labor. And so I think about what's the material record of Black business history, right? If you were to think about any Black business you know, and you want to tell their story through objects, what kind of objects would you need? So for example, Madam C.J. Walker, if you want to tell her story, what kind of objects would you need? You might need some pomade. You might need a straightening comb, right? You may need multiple other things, right? That Madam C.J. Walker manufactured and created in her business, right? If you were thinking of Magdalena Walker, the first Black woman to own a bank, right? You know, what would you need to tell Magdalena Walker's story? You might need a calculator, right? You might need the actual adding machine that she used to add up the pennies and nickels, right? That people donated to her bank. And so as a curator, that's what I do. I think about Black history, but from the object's perspective.
Hi, don't be shy, y'all. And if you could come over this way, I can run it to you if you need it, but otherwise, if you want to come over this way. Don't be shy, I know y'all have questions. All right.
Yes,
We'll
question.
take one here, and then Dr. Barrett, come your way.
So, I wanted to know how much of this information is offered through the Y? Like, do they talk about how like they impeded these women and then show how they changed the organization once they left?
That's a great question. And it really goes back to kind of thinking about what kind of records the Y kept, right? But not only what kind of records the Y kept, who has access to these records? And so one of the answers to your question is that yes, the Y was honest about its the difficulties it had with racism, right, in its organization. But whether or not it credited Bernice Copeland Lindsay or Nana Reed Baker or Jean Hopkins with forcing them to reckon with the racism is a different story. Additionally, because I'm a researcher and because I have access to go to the archives, as I mentioned, I was able to go and read the Y's records, right? I was able to go and look at the records that the organization donated actually to the Wisconsin State Historical Society. And so I looked through numbers of boxes, countless minutes, years and years of reports. But what I began to notice as I looked at those reports, and what I really wanted to kind of hone in on, is that those reports and those minutes were often incomplete, which is why I really brought in the story of the Chicago Defender, right? The Chicago Defender had that headline, Black, Negro white workers resigns when Lily White program starts. Now, I didn't find that type of headline in the Y records, right? But what that told me was that there was something going on, right? There was some records that weren't being kept by the Y, and it was up to me as a historian to piece together all of those stories to be able to understand what was going on there.
Thank you. I just got poked in the ribs, so this will be my last question. And before I say that, one thing that I forgot to say, I want to give a real thank you to President Rivera, to Professor Duchess Harris, and to Ms. Miana Kerr, and there are probably many others for getting you here at such short notice.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now, this will really be my last question because my ribs are sore from the president and CEO of the Minneapolis Y, but that's another story. And I call her president and Madam President and CEO when she gets me angry, but that's a whole nother story. I want to know what on earth got you interested in the Milwaukee YWCA of all the things. It's fascinating.
This is such a great question. To be honest, this story, like I said, I've been thinking about it and working on it for nearly 2 decades because it was the story I wrote for my master's thesis in graduate school. And when you are okay, I'll back up. I went to graduate school right after undergraduate. I did not actually major in history, so I I didn't really know what I was doing as a historian. But I was in graduate school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I was trying to figure out, what did I want to learn about Black women, right? Because I always knew that Black activist women was something I wanted to learn more about. Going to graduate school in the state of Wisconsin, I also knew that the largest Black community was in Milwaukee. Being at the University of Wisconsin and being right near the State Historical Society, I was able to literally walk from class to the archives. Back and forth to the archives. I just spent time in the records, right? And what happened was I was writing a paper in my first class on Black women's activism, and I read something about the University of Wisconsin campus Y. In those papers, it noted in the 1940s, the Milwaukee Y is being celebrated for its interracial practices. And I was like, okay. I filed that for later because that sounds like that's not true. But anyway, I finished that paper and I had to then decide, what am I going to write from a master's thesis? And I went right back over to the archives and I said, does this archive have the records of the Milwaukee Y? And sure enough, it did. It had the records of the organization from 1896 when it opened until 1979. Over 100 boxes of records, of minutes, of reports, of photos and clippings, and so I wrote about them for my master's thesis. So, yeah. I do like records. And that was, oh, yes.
Hello, I just wanted to thank you again for your lecture. My question is, what are the things you find material cannot account for, and what do you do when you encounter these shortcomings?
Can you repeat that one more time?
Yes. What are the things you find material cannot account for, and what do you do when you encounter these shortcomings?
That is such a great question, because a lot of our life is ephemeral, right? The objects just go away, and then what do? I think in terms of thinking about that particular difficulty is where a combination between textual analysis and material culture has to go hand in hand, right? And so what I mean by that is, so take for example the lives of enslaved women, right? Who write about the work they do in their own personal lives and in kitchens, right, in their homes, right? We know they're encountering certain objects in their lives, but we may not know. We may no longer have access to those objects. Does that mean those objects didn't exist? No, it doesn't. But it means we have to find another way to think about the materiality of their lives, and usually that has to come with some sort of textual record that you then compare and contrast with.
Hello.
Hello.
I wanted to ask, while you were finding out about the Milwaukee Y, were there other Ys across the country that were also going through similar instances, or other organizations that were going through similar instances?
Yes, that's such a great question. And if I had another hour, or if I had 100,000 more words that I could write, we could really go in depth. As I mentioned, the Y is a national organization. And what I also kind of mentioned very quickly, right, is that in some ways the character of the Y depended on where the Y was, right? And so there were Ys all over the nation, and they primarily developed, as I mentioned, in urban locales, because they were really trying to reach a particular type of working woman who was engaging in this industrial and manufacturing work. And so there were Ys all across the country, particularly in thinking about Black women's experiences with the Y. Typically what happened was Black women had to petition to the local white Y in order to get themselves a branch. If the local white Y did not agree to the Black women's petition, then there wouldn't be a Y, right? And so many times it was this back and forth with white women, whether a Black Y or not could exist. In the Milwaukee case, the actual reverse happened, right? White women said, oh, we want to engage Black women, so let us then create these clubs, let's partner with the Urban League, let's hire Black working women. But the emergence of Black women's participations differed across time and space.
Hello. Thank you for your commitment to telling the stories that we need and that we deserve. Appreciate it. On that note, history is never the same, but it does have its similarities, right? And it seemed like we all kind of related to the response to the stance that they took institutionally and based on their laurels and integrity. And because we're in this moment of reckoning again institutionally, because there's so many sisters at the forefront and that are exposed within these institutions, I'm wondering whether the same direct approach is necessary, or whether you think that there's something that can be more beneficial in this time period. And I would just love your opinion specifically.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when I think about that answer, I never want to kind of generalize or prescribe people's actions or decisions. I think the Milwaukee Y women who we learn about today, they refuse the Y because of their specific experiences and their specific understanding that, hey, if we stay here, there's a limit to what we can do. And they wanted to do more, right? And so that's why they left. And so when thinking about our institutional connections and collaborations, it's always worth reflecting on what can you do where you are. If you can do more, then perhaps you stay. But if you have reached a point where, okay, I can't do any more, I don't have the resources, be they financial, be they personal, I need to move on, right? And so I think that becomes both a personal decision, but then you saw these women also making it a collective decision, right? They weren't just saying, oh, the Y didn't pay me, so I'm going to leave. They were saying, the Y didn't pay us. The Y disrespected us. The Y abandoned our community, right? And so there was some limitations to what they wanted to continue to collaborate on and people who they wanted to work with. And so I think it's always worth reflecting on the particular circumstances and not just saying, well, I'm just going to refuse everything and everybody, but thinking about how you can work with people and why you might want to continue that commitment.
This will be the last question.
Thank you for such an informative lecture. I had a question. I'm not sure how tangential it is, but you mentioned, I think it was Baker who was religious. Do you know, I'll just hold this. Do you know how her faith and how the religious culture of her community might have interacted or come into conflict with the white Christian affiliation of the Y?
That's a great question. I don't know particularly kind of which Black denomination or which Black church she attended, but what I do know is that especially during this time period, these Black women workers were attracted to the Y because of its Christian commitment, right? Because of the ways in which they saw the Y trying to live out this kind of mandate, right? That you help the least of these, right? That you think about your community in certain type of religious and spiritual ways, inflected by your religious and spiritual and faith beliefs. And so that was one of the reasons they did this work, because they saw a very direct connection between racial justice and spiritual responsibility, right? And so because there were a number of different organizations these women could have joined and became members of, right? I mentioned some. The Urban League, right? They could have went to the NAACP, right? They could have joined other social or political organizations, but they chose the Y. And right now we short it to the Y, but the Christian part of the Y was supremely important during that time. Thank you for the question.
Please join me in thanking tonight's speaker.